Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming, and for those online as well. So I'm Quinton Dealey, Chair of the Maudsley Philosophy Group, and I'm delighted to introduce Jasper Feyaerts. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
No, but
How
doesn't matter too much.
Let's clarify. How should I pronounce your last name?
Feyaerts.
Feyaerts, okay. So Jasper's going to talk to us, to give a presentation of a perspective that has been developing on the self in schizophrenia, the self-ipseity model, which has been developing with Professor Louis Sass. And so we can think of this to an extent as a two-part presentation, because Jasper's going to set out a presentation now of the model, which will give us an opportunity to discuss it. And then in January, Professor Sass will also be giving a complementary presentation, which will allow us to develop and extend the discussion around this model. So Jasper is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at Ghent University, where he's affiliated with the Department of Psychoanalysis and Clinical Consulting. So he adopts an interdisciplinary approach using insights from phenomenology, psychoanalysis, philosophy, and neuroscience. And he's got a current focus on phenomenological psychopathology, and with a particular interest in delusions and psychosis. He's got quite a broad-ranging set of influences. He's engaged with psychoanalytic theories, including those of Lacan and Freud, as well as Wittgensteinian perspectives, and he's brought that to develop understanding of schizophrenic experiences. So I will hand over to you now, Jasper. Thank you very much for joining us. We're looking forward to this.
Thank you, Quinton, and thanks for inviting me. So you did the introduction, so I don't need to introduce myself again. So I can skip the first part. And just because I am invited here in London, so I'll just take the opportunity to do some announcements, which is that I have, aside from my regular research interests, I have a more long-standing interest also in the philosophical dimensions of psychosis. Does everybody hear me all right?
Speak up a bit.
Speak up a bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a funny old acoustic thing.
Yeah, okay, I'll try. So I want to take advantage of this occasion and invitation to draw attention to the two Matter Be True conferences that I co-organize together with Wouter Kusters, who is the author of, you should read his book, A Philosophy of Madness. He's a philosopher and an expert by experience. And we organize the two Matter Be True conferences, which is, which aims to bring together philosophers, clinical researchers, experts by experience, patients, mental health workers around the topic of madness. And these events take place at the, if I may say so, wonderful Museum for Psychiatry and for Outsider Art in Ghent, Belgium, Museum Dr. Ghislain. And we currently have a call for papers for our fourth edition already of the Two Matter Be True conference, which will have as its general theme madness and its expressions. Voilà, that's all for the self-advertising. So this talk, as Quinton already mentioned, will be the first one in a two-part series, and in which I, together with my collaborator, Louis Sass, will discuss some of our recent work, in which we've proposed a critical revision of what is widely considered to be one of the most influential models of altered selfhood in schizophrenia, so the so-called ipseity-disorder or basic self-disturbance model, which was originally developed by Louis Sass and Joseph Parnasse and published in 2003. So for those of you who might be interested, this talk and the next one by Louis will draw on a series of closely connected articles, including 2 companion articles published in Schizophrenia Bulletin, one in Schizophrenia Research, Schizophrenia the Very Idea, and then a more philosophical, speculative one in Philosophical Psychology that explores the potential of a so-called transparency view of consciousness for understanding self-disorders. So I won't go into that particular paper in this lecture, but it might be interesting to some of you. Some of our very recent papers, one in Lancet Psychiatry and the other one in Psychology, in Psychopathology, develop some of the implications of our revised model for attempts to model and to predict the onset of psychosis in so-called high-risk populations. Okay, so before I dive into the critical discussion of the original self-disturbance model, it might be helpful first to... Thanks a lot. It's much more cozy now. It might be helpful to first offer a brief overview of the original model and some of its ideas concerning the nature and also the significance of self-disorders in schizophrenia. And next I will point towards certain important aspects of self and reality experience which we believe were insufficiently appreciated and acknowledged in the original model. And then I will conclude with some implications of our revision for the understanding, general understanding of self-disturbance for research and for clinical practice. And then in his talk next week, Louis Sass, no, not next week, in January, Louis Sass will say more about the notion of hyperreflexivity and how that notion might be able to explain the various and sometimes also paradoxical aspects of self and reality experience that I will emphasize in this specific lecture. Okay. Now the central idea that I will put into more context as I progress is that schizophrenia-spectrum disorders involve, at least in part, disorder of the self or of a certain kind of self-awareness. And in the contemporary research context, this idea is already a bit unusual, given that on the one hand there is a widespread skepticism regarding the very notion of schizophrenia, which is being more and more being replaced by a more unitary view of psychosis, and so without distinct clinical subtypes and without any sharp boundaries with the general population. And furthermore, psychotic disorders are currently mainly defined in terms of symptoms like delusions and hallucinations, or negative symptoms. So there's actually no real mention of self-disorders in the DSM-5, although they will be reintroduced, at least I heard, as defining features of schizophrenia in the ICD-11. Now, phenomenologically considered, this disappearance of self-disorders from diagnostic manuals can be considered as an example of a more general negative trend in psychiatric description and psychiatric diagnosis and research, which is being increasingly dominated by rather superficial measurement practices, by big N data sets, and an overall neurobiological focus with insufficient attention to the depth and complexities of subjective experience. And this loss of phenomenological detail has been argued to be one of the major factors behind the current standstill in many areas of psychiatric research, which is a development, or perhaps better, a downfall, that is very, very nicely described in an older paper by Nancy Andreasen, entitled DSM and the Death of Phenomenology in America, an example of unintended consequences. And in the context that I'm currently considering, so the phenomenological argument is that increased attention to the subjective dimension of psychosis, in which self-disorders play a major role, would allow to confer diagnostic unity to schizophrenia-spectrum disorders, so to really see what actually holds together this diagnosis despite its obvious clinical heterogeneity. So something that would remain obscure if we would only focus on symptomatic criteria. Could I get a glass of water?
Yeah.
Is that possible? Thanks a lot. Now, the idea that alterations of self-experience have some kind of special relevance to schizophrenia is certainly not a new idea. And in fact, it can be found in throughout the long history of psychiatry and in most of the major figures. So just to name a few examples. So, for example, Emil Kraepelin, considered a disunity of consciousness as a core feature of schizophrenia, so which he described in terms of the metaphor as an orchestra without a conductor, and so again pointing towards disturbance of the sense of self. Eugen Bleuler listed ego disorders among his so-called fundamental symptoms, which he considered to be specific to schizophrenia. And by contrast, he grouped delusions and hallucinations among his so-called secondary symptoms, so regarding them as being diagnostically non-specific, because these symptoms are also found, of course, in other disorders. And note that this is actually the exact opposite of the current situation, where these symptoms are used to define schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Then Karl Jaspers, who is one of the major figures within phenomenological psychiatry, observed that for the patient with schizophrenia, the sense of self-present was somehow fundamentally weakened. And I quote Karl Jaspers: "The individual, though he exists, is no longer able to feel he exists. Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, may still be superficially cogitated, but it is no longer a valid experience." And then another important figure to mention in this context is a student of Karl Jaspers, namely Kurt Schneider, who proposed a list of so-called first-ranked symptoms, which he considered to be definitive indicators of schizophrenia, which was later also incorporated within DSM-3 and in the ICD-10. And all these symptoms are quite specific in the sense that they involve a certain passivization or a fundamental distortion of the normal sense of volition and of inwardness. And so Schneider emphasized a so-called radical qualitative change of consciousness, so a change involving a disturbed first-personal givenness, Ichheit, or minus Meinhaftigkeit of experience. Thanks a lot.
Yes, if you could speak up a bit, you help those online.
I will try my best. Yeah. Okay, so as is apparent from the foregoing overview, the importance of self-disorders for the diagnosis of schizophrenia was emphasized by most authors who took an interest in the subjective side of psychosis. Yet it's also true that there was in fact no consistent, or at least no philosophically adequate definition of self-disorders, but mostly a rich compilation of various symptoms of various experiences. So the question is, how are we to define the relevant concept of self in self-disorders more precisely? And so what is the kind of self that we are referring to, and equally important, precisely how should this self be considered to be disturbed? And of course, if the concept of self is defined too loosely, then trivially all mental problems will to some extent count as disorders of selfhood and would fail to realize what might be specific to schizophrenic self-disorders. Now, in the phenomenological tradition that I'm currently considering, the relevant concept of self is that of the most basic or also the most minimal sense of self. So here we are concerned not with problems, self-related problems that are typical of personality disorders, so certain aspects, for example, of one's character or of one's temperament that often cause problems in interpersonal relationships. Let's say, for example, a dependent personality type, And so such problems are considered to occur at the narrative level of self, and so which refers to a complex identity structure that is developed through interactions with others throughout life. And so this is a kind of self that is dependent upon language, culture, and on narrative self-understanding. Now, while there may also be problems in schizophrenia at this level of the narrative self, the kind of disturbances that we're currently considering occur at a much more basic level, a much more fundamental level, and so affecting the very structure of one's experience and more precisely the normally immediate sense of being the subject of one's experience, which has been described by the phenomenological philosopher Dan Zahavi as the minimal self. Now, this minimal self concerns a usually implicit, pre-reflective self-awareness, and so an awareness of oneself that normally does not require any introspection or any act of identification. As for example, I normally do not need to inquire into who is the subject thinking my thoughts to know that I am thinking, nor do I need to ask myself who is the person feeling my pains. And this is something that is normally immediately given to me without any need for reflection. And these assumptions are in fact so deeply ingrained in our general existential outlook that to actually state them explicitly, so for example by telling one's friends I own my own thoughts or I feel my own pains, will come across as slightly awkward, as if any alternative were in fact impossible to conceive. So as the philosopher Peter Strawson wrote, I quote, "It would make no sense to ask, this inner experience is occurring, but is it occurring to me?" It is, however, this very minimal sense of self that, according to the phenomenological self-disturbance model, is affected in schizophrenia. So this disorder of minimal self manifests as failing pre-reflective self-presence, so causing the experiential field to become increasingly alienated, anonymized, and reified or objectified. So in short, we start to experience our own innermost mental life as if it were external objects. And to just give some clinical examples to illustrate this idea. So for example, thoughts may appear as if they are from at a distance from patients who may report that they need to listen to their own thoughts in order to know what they are thinking, or that they perceive their own thoughts like subtitles in a movie, so requiring them to read them in order to know what they are thinking. Patients may also describe that their thoughts feel as if they were not generated by themselves, or that they have too many thoughts, occurring without them being able to properly think them through. One's own body can also be affected by the sense of self-alienation. Some patients may report that their minds and their body are disconnected, or as if the body at times is disintegrating. Patients also frequently report demarcation problems, such as the experience of being too open without any psychic barriers, as if others merely by looking at them know what they are currently thinking, or that others are constantly making allusions or remarks to what patients are thinking. Just to give some examples. Okay, now theoretically, the disturbance of minimal self is considered to involve three interrelated aspects. The first is hyperreflexivity, which refers to a kind of exaggerated self-awareness, so a tendency to focus focal attention to direct focal attention to aspects of oneself that are normally experienced in a more tacit way or in a more implicit manner. So, for example, focused attention on the very act of breathing or on the very process of thinking thoughts. And such a focused form of attention forces such implicit aspects to become experienced as if they were external objects. So consider, for example, the kind of alienated experience that we can have when we listen to our own voice on a recording. So in such a case, it also seems like there is a kind of experiential distance between myself and the experience of my own voice, which I seem unable to fully identify with. And so this would be one everyday example, everyday analog to this dimension of hyperreflexivity. The second aspect is diminished self-presence, and this refers to a weakened sense of existing as a vital and a coherent subject of awareness. So, as we've seen in some of these examples, patients may frequently describe pervasive inner void or a lack of self-presence. They may complain about a certain numbness or a certain opacity of consciousness, like they're feeling in a fog. I quote, "It is as if I am not a part of this world. I have this strange ghostly feeling, as if I was from another planet. I'm almost non-existent. It is as if I'm not really sitting here. It's just my body that you see, but somehow I am not in it." Now, these experiences of diminished self-presence may again lead to a hyper-reflexive form of self-observation. So in order to compensate for this original loss of self-presence, but which may in fact only worsen this sense of self-alienation. I quote, I constantly have to ask myself who I actually am. It is hard to explain. Most of the time I have this very strange thing. I watch myself very closely, so illustrating this form of hyper-reflexive self-observation. Like, how am I doing now and where are the parts? I think about that so much that I cannot do anything else. It is not easy when you change from day to day, as if you were a totally different person all of a sudden. So, as may be already apparent from the example that I just cited, these two aspects, so hyperreflexivity and diminished self-presence, can be thought to be two complementary processes. So whereas the notion of hyperreflexivity emphasizes the way in which something that is normally implicitly experienced as part of myself becomes explicit and so detached, diminished self-presence emphasizes the obverse of this very same process. So the fact that what was once implicit is no longer being inhabited as an aspect of taken for granted selfhood. And so intense introspection does seem to have the capacity to estrange us from ourselves. And so think, for example, about what might happen if we focus long enough and intensely enough on our own eyes in the mirror. So it seems that such focusing transforms the experience of my eyes from being a transparent medium of perception to becoming strangely material eyeballs somehow located in my skull. Thirdly, these complementary distortions of hyperreflexivity and diminished self-presence are also considered to be accompanied by alterations of a person's grip or a person's hold on the experiential field of awareness. And so this connection between, on the one hand, changes in self-experience and in the other, changes in world experience can be understood in the following way. So normally, self-awareness can be seen as a kind of necessary condition for goal-oriented action and for the perception of meaning, because consciousness of ourselves as persons with certain needs, with certain projects and motivations forms the basis for the meaning and salience of the world. As for example, the very look of the world will be different when I'm in a depressed mood, with all things looking rather unappealing and uninviting and flat, than when I'm feeling cheerful or excited. And so therefore, a distorted experience of subjectivity will also lead to a distortion in our experience of the world. So there will be no longer any clear goal-directedness, no distinction between means and ends, and no reason why certain objects would appear in the foreground of my attention, while others would recede in the background of my experience. And this can explain certain aspects of reality experience that often occur in schizophrenia, which are often characterized by forms of derealization, so experience that lacks the depths of normal forms of perception, but also sometimes by a kind of preoccupation with the very existence of objects. So a very focus on the fact that the world exists rather than how the world is or what the world contains. And these aspects are well illustrated by the following description of a patient called René, a patient by Seshai, in her autobiography of a schizophrenic girl, for whom things, and I quote, looked smooth as metal, so cut off, so detached from each other, so illuminated and tense that they filled me with terror. When, for example, I looked at a chair or a jug, I thought not of their use or their function. A jar not as something to hold water and milk, a chair not as something to sit in, but as having lost their names, their functions and meanings. They became things and began to take on life, to exist. So again, foregrounding this kind of ontological dimension. This existence accounted for my great fear in the unreal scene, in the murky quiet of my perception. Suddenly the thing sprang up. The stone jar, decorated with blue flowers, was there, facing me, defying me with its presence, with its existence. Okay, I think this suffices for as a way to clinically illustrate the self-disturbance model. Now, it is also argued that this type of self-disturbance has an important role to play in differential diagnosis by distinguishing the phenomenology of schizophrenia from other psychiatric conditions. So the latter are either seen to involve self-related problems that are qualitatively different from minimal self-disturbance. So, for example, problems with the continuity of personal identity in borderline personality disorders, or with self-worth in major depression, or to display minimal self-disturbance to a lesser degree, as in schizotypal or schizoaffective conditions. Now, empirical support for these claims comes from studies using the so-called EASE instruments, so the examination of anomalous self-experience, which is a line of research that has recently received systematic review and meta-analysis. Yet the significance of basic self-disturbance according to the self-disturbance model goes beyond being a mere characteristic diagnostic feature. So the model more strongly views basic self-disturbance as the so-called core disturbance of schizophrenia, so a disturbance which permeates and underlies all its diverse symptoms and manifestations. And so, for example, it is suggested that delusions and hallucinations develop in the context of self-disturbances, and that such symptoms would be misunderstood when abstracted away from this experiential context. So such an integrative view on schizophrenia contrasts with the single symptom approach that is often adopted in current research. So, for example, exclusively focusing on hallucinations or on paranoid delusions. But it does align with earlier attempts to capture the core disorder or so-called trouble générateur in schizophrenia by, for example, Jaspers, Klaus Conrad, or Eugene Minkowski. Okay, I won't have time to delve into the neurocognitive implications, but I will have something to say about it at the end of this presentation. Now, earlier work had already questioned the supposed diagnostic specificity of basic self-disturbance for the schizophrenia spectrum. It also questions the alleged independence of minimal selfhood from interpersonal forms of experience, and more broadly from contextual events and stressors. But here, and that's also the focus of the twin articles with Louis Sass, I want to focus on more fundamental issues that specifically target the descriptive adequacy of the model to capture the clinical heterogeneity and variability of self-disorder. A first issue concerns the current model's nearly exclusive emphasis on so-called diminished self-presence. as being the prototypical manifestation of self-disorder. And such a loss or diminished self-presence is especially prominent, as we've just seen in Schneider's first-ranked symptoms, which do indeed suggest a kind of passivization or a loss of ownership over thought, experience, and action. Yet there are also other alterations of self-experience, highly prominent in clinical presentations and indeed in classical descriptions of schizophrenia that seem to entail just the opposites. So not diminishment of normal selfhood, but a kind of inflation or exaggeration of the ordinary boundaries of subjectivity. Such what might be termed increased self-presence is apparent in the following two highly characteristic modes of a schizophrenic experience. First, in what might be termed subjectivism, or also quasi-solipsism, there is a tendency to experience and to consider things as being somehow contained within or as somehow dependent on the perspective of one's own consciousness. As for example, many of the delusions that are most typical of schizophrenia seem not to be believed by the patient in the usual sense, that is, as referring to literal facts existing within the context of everyday reality, but rather as pertaining to a kind of subjective or quasi-virtual domain that is often kept apart from the shared world and is often associated with forms of so-called double bookkeeping. Such delusions are frequently described by patients in a way that suggests an acute awareness of one's own subjectivity. As when the patient experiences his delusional experiences as being only relevant or only exclusively accessible from its own perspective, or as only existing before what the famous patient Daniel Paul Schreber called the mind's eye. I quote Schreber, "It is by no means impossible that seeing is confined to my person and my immediate surroundings." This kind of subjectivism or quasi-solipsism can also apply to patients' experience of what to others would seem objectively real. And so even actual objects and the external world can be experienced as somehow produced by one's own consciousness. As when, again, Schreber spoke of what he called miracled up people, or of insects that existed only when he looked at them. So in such experiences, which are common in schizophrenia, the normal experience of reality as being an autonomous and subject-independent domain seems to be undermined not by any lack or by any reduced sense of self-presence, but to the contrary, by an excessive or exaggerated self-awareness of the role of one's own consciousness as the grounding of the world. Second type of experience that seems to challenge the model's emphasis on the loss of self is what might be termed ontological paranoia. And this form of paranoia is not primarily concerned with the content of reality, so with issues existing within the world, such as, for example, worrying that a robber would be poised to attack, but with a pervasive sense of being oneself the center of all of reality, and as a result of being the inevitable target of or object of attention towards which all messages and all meanings would seem to be directed. I quote a patient, "I feel like the universe is zoned in on me." So such encompassing paranoid experience does not seem to derive primarily from some exceptional personal characteristics that might that might solicit persecutory attention, but again from an acute and an incessant awareness of one's own centrality as a conscious and a knowing subject. And here again, the idea that ontological paranoia could be associated with a kind of diminished self-presence seems implausible. And so for why, after all, would a person who feels that he or she does not exist as a conscious self sense that everything somehow revolves around herself? So what ontological paranoia actually suggests is again a kind of exaggerated self-presence, or an intensified and often anxiety-ridden awareness of one's own subjectivity. A further challenge for the model's notion of diminished self-presence is the fact that many patients seem to shift or waver between the poles of diminished and expanded selfhood, or even paradoxically to maintain both positions at the same moment. As when a patient, for example, who declares himself omnipotent and ruler of the universe may also say he doesn't exist, or that his body or thoughts are under alien control. The patient is, and here I quote one of the earliest descriptions of schizophrenia by John Haslam, sometimes an automaton, moved by the agency of other persons. At others, he is the emperor of the whole world. In another classical case of the so-called influencing machine delusion, described by the psychoanalyst Victor Tausk, all that the patient experienced seemed to exist only in her own field of awareness, so suggesting an increased form of self-presence. But she also experienced herself as a machine manipulated by a mysterious man. So in such cases, these apparently opposed and incommensurable tendencies seem somehow deeply interconnected. And in fact, a number of first-person accounts of altered self in schizophrenia emphasize that such self-non-self paradoxes may lie at the core of the condition, so contributing also to its paradigmatically bizarre character. And so in this vein, a recent paper by Clara Hamston described schizophrenia, and I quote, as a paradoxical condition experienced from within the paradox itself. But as with the cases of exaggerated self-presence, it is difficult to see how the model's current focus on diminished self-presence would be able to capture such paradoxical combinations. I see I have another 10 minutes or 5 minutes, or I'm already past. I'm already almost finished. Yeah. Now, further and rather similar remarks can be made with regard to the model's nearly exclusive emphasis and negative accounts of disturbed grip or hold. I will skip this part, but just in summary, this again primarily emphasizes forms of reality experience in which the meaningful and organized quality of the normal world seems diminished, whereas the opposites, namely forms of hyper-organization or of increased coherence, may also occur. But I will conclude my talk now with some of the implications of what I've been discussing. So I've discussed several phenomena that are neglected in the current model, which all point towards the highly heterogeneous nature of the self-disordering that may occur in schizophrenia. Such heterogeneity may involve differences between different individual patients, between subgroup of patients, but it may also involve dynamic shifts or combinations within a particular patient. And all this suggests the need to theoretically revise both the self-disturbance model descriptive accounts, about which I will say a few words now, but also its more fundamental underlying theoretical assumptions, which will be taken up by Professor Saas in his talk. First, on a descriptive level, a revised self-disorder model will need to postulate the broader notions of altered self-presence and of altered grip hold, while recognizing that each of these distinctive alterations can move toward either diminishment or increasement. And such recognition would avoid the common error in our field of conflating any deviation from normalcy with some kind of diminishment or decline. But it may also contribute to enhanced clinical management as well as explanatory research. In a clinical context, acknowledging instances of increased self-presence may afford a more adequate understanding of such prominent experiences in schizophrenia as paranoid anxiety or feelings of exceptionality. And the revised model allows these to be understood not in terms of motivated reasoning biases, which is a common but also a contested CBT-oriented explanation, but rather as generated and sustained by more basic experiential changes involving exaggerated self-awareness. Similarly, recognizing how reality in schizophrenia may not only be perplexing and doubtful, but also sometimes unusually meaningful and coherent, can help mental health professionals understand why patients may sometimes hold ambiguous or even positive attitudes towards their symptoms, or why their stance is seldom touched by offering contrary evidence or logical arguments. And so overall, increased awareness of the sometimes paradoxical nature of self-disorder can overcome the sense of incomprehensibility and thereby improve the empathic alignment between patients and caregivers. Finally, in terms of explanatory research, our revision encourages expanding the focus of current neurocognitive models of self-disorders. And most research on underlying neurocognitive mechanisms have focused on clinical examples involving diminished self-presence. Now, the broader heterogeneity of self-disorders that I've been emphasizing suggests the need to reconsider to what extent these neurocognitive models are or can be made compatible with this experiential variability. I won't go into that issue right now, but perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A. Addressing these issues will be important to increase appreciation and perhaps eventually explanation that schizophrenia, rather than involving a deficit state, can involve a heightening of forms of awareness that seem almost definitive of human subjectivity. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you. So thanks very much, Jasper. Any questions, comments, thoughts, reflections at the moment?
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I was wondering whether in the model that you presented at the beginning, where we see the three main components, hyperreflexivity, losing the grip, and minimal self-disturbances, whether, like, your thoughts on the relationship between these from an etiological perspective, because I was thinking on how schizophrenia, where schizophrenia stands for. Is it starting from hyperreflexivity and then this influence the minimal self-disturbance, or does it start from minimal self-disturbance and then the hyperreflexivity is a consequence,
Mhm.
because you might see hyperreflexivity in other clinical conditions or even non-clinical conditions. For example, I'm thinking about obsessive compulsive disorder or just obsessive traits where people become hyper-aware of aspects of themselves which usually go unnoticed or tacit, such as the breathing, the thinking process, or even just philosophers themselves. Sometimes they start thinking about their own existence and start posing questions.
Absolutely.
So I was curious about your thoughts on what is the main difference between the hyperreflexivity that we see in schizophrenia and these other forms of hyperreflexivity, which may not lead to delusions, hallucination, and losing that so much contact with reality.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a great question, and of course, the presence of hyperreflexivity not only in various forms of psychopathology, but also, for example, for the philosopher who perhaps contemplates too much about basic aspects of existence, have not escaped our notice, and it's a very important issue. One of the things that we have come up with as a sort of tentative answer is that it really depends on what kind of aspects of your experience that hyperreflexive focusing is directed on. That's, for example, if in obsessive-compulsive disorders, there is often a kind of hyperreflexive rumination over everyday aspects of existence, right? For example, my own position within interpersonal relationships, but this mostly remains within the kind of ordinary realm of experience. Whereas when we begin to focus on these normally very implicit and often not really explicitly acknowledged aspects of experience, then we could perhaps have a kind of development as the one we described in schizophrenia. So in that sense, potentially the major issue is on what kind of objects or aspects of experience that hyperreflexivity is directed towards, rather than the presence of hyperreflexivity itself as the real pathological factor. This is just one suggestion, of course.
John.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. First of all, I've got a factual question, which you may be able to help with. I've also got a theoretical critique, which I want to bring in. So the factual question is, what is the difference between Zass's views now and his views in 1994 when he produced a book which really covered most of this, called The Paradox of Delusion, which you obviously know him well. So can you summarise in a few words what changes, because we're now 32 years on, it's a long time,
Yeah.
what changes in his views have there been, say, in the last 10 years? Is that possible you could answer that?
Yeah. Well, I think some of the original ideas in Sass's work, for example, in Madness and Modernism, but also in Paradoxes of Delusions, got in a way watered down a bit.
Sorry?
Watered down, is that a proper English expression? Yeah. So got reduced to this very nearly, sort of exclusive view on diminished forms of self-experience, whereas originally in some of these ideas, although it wasn't really explicitly formulated in these books, there was also this recognition of a kind of increased self-presence in these forms of experience. And the thing that we have done in this more recent work is to draw this out more explicitly and to just perhaps even as a sort of reminder of the potential of Sass's original work for the
So are
current
you saying
field.
he's given an exaggerated recognition of the second form of self-disorder.
Yes, and also in terms of the kind of changes in reality experience, which weren't actually explicitly described in Sass's original work, but we've, well,
Can I just
tried to
ask
do
a
so. Yeah,
theoretical
sure.
point? See, the trouble with Louis Sasser, who's my hero, he's one of the people who influenced me the most, is that he takes this ipseity model, and I think he generalizes it too much, you see. He doesn't seem to understand that there are certain delusions, for instance, Capgras delusion, all the delusional identification, that doesn't explain it at all.
Mm-hmm.
There are also, because I went through all the different first-rank symptoms, and I recognized that something like 2/3 of Schneider's first-rank symptoms can be explained by the ipseity model. But there are a number of Schneider's first-rank symptoms that can't. There's a sort of spatial, there's a problem with space, there's a problem with time, there's a problem not just with what I call me-ness or I-ness,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a problem with you-ness as well, that the schizophrenic thinks their wife is, an imposter. So there are a number of delusions and hallucinations that I don't think that can explain. And what I wanted to know, that's why I said it, is he generalizing his view even more, or is he sort of sticking to the original point? I mean, I've discussed it with Sass, and I'll discuss it again.
Yeah.
Would you like to say something about your own views about this? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, we're very
Sure.
positive, but
Yeah.
have you got any criticism of this sort of generalization of the ipseity model to bring in everything onto the kitchen sink?
Yeah, well, it feels a bit uncomfortable to speak on Louis' behalf, but so I won't. But in any case, I don't
He
think
will,
that.
man, he's a very tough man.
I know. I don't think he's proposing a sort of generalized account that may be able to explain all kinds of delusions. At least in his work, he makes a distinction between types of delusions. Ones that might be more conducive to this kind of self-disturbance model, and others that might be more, for example, be able to explain by more a cognitive behavioral perspective, right? And in terms of alterations of space and time, there is, aside from the ease interview, there is this companion or sister interview, namely the EWE, examination of anomalous world experience, which consists of various domains, amongst which time experience and alterations of speciality. And there is a very developed account of how these ideas could also bear on these kind of alterations. So,
All right, I think you've asked my question. Thank you very much.
yeah.
I think we have an online
Yes, we do have an online question, and this is important because there's been some technical qualities, so I'm feeling very bad about the online community. They've not had a good experience with this tonight, I'm afraid. But this is a question to you, Jasper, from Rick Bellar, and it's a great question actually, because he wants to know, can somebody self-induce or induce self-disorders? Can they decide to do that voluntarily? So, is it under volition, or is there something to self-disorders that's essentially involuntary and beyond agency?
Is that a philosophical or an empirical question?
Well, I think you can take it as both, can't you?
Yeah.
So you can, or either. So answer it
I know, but
whichever way you like.
I know at this point I have been discussing Rick before, and he takes issue with the idea that hyperreflexivity would describe a kind of process that would be, in a way, conceptually distinct from feelings of diminished self-presence. And so indeed the real question is whether we can indeed come up with a form of hyperreflexivity that would not necessarily or conceptually involve diminished self-presence. I mean, I have no real answer to that, and I'm also actually still grappling with the idea that this is in a way, whether this is, that's why I asked this, whether this is an empirical question or a philosophical one. At least I can imagine how sort of intense hyper-reflexive introspection can actually induce a state of self-alienation. That's something I could imagine, and there is actually some empirical research on that. But I have the a sort of suspicion that this answer will not suffice for Rick's concerns. Yeah.
Could I have a follow-up question, which is in some way follows on from that and may perhaps help to address it, because, and also perhaps links to the first question as well, because one of the things that I found myself thinking about when you're giving a presentation is to what extent are there analogous forms of experience, or distinct forms of experience, which potentially could be informed by this model or concept of altered self-experience, altered ipseity. So, for example, when you're talking about the alteration and the hold on the world, the grasp on the world, I was tending to place that within the larger category of what in psychopathology is called derealization. But actually, both within the psychedelic literature and also within the literature about meditation, there is this theme of certain of experiential changes arising, in which you get this sort of accentuated sense of the presence and vividness of objects in the world. And Alan Watts, when he was, the writer Alan Watts, who was a sort of mid-century interpreter of the Buddhist and sort of broadly Eastern meditative traditions, he used to use this word suchness to describe, so the sort of suchness of this cup, which is kind of rather intense and overwhelming.
It's very close to the ontological dimension that I...
Yes, that's right. So this is a term that he's translating a Sanskrit term to describe this. So this, of course, is actually very well described in the psychedelic literature, and it's also described in the Buddhist literature. So one way of thinking about this, setting aside the sort of fluidity and complexity of psychedelic experience for a moment, which actually in some ways might be a better analog for what's going on in the case of psychosis. In the meditative traditions, I think what may be happening is that people are cultivating practices which stabilise, or seek to stabilise particular shifts in awareness, which alter the balance between a sort of ratiocinative, reflective thinking self, which is a sort of attenuation of the narrative self, and a sort of foregrounding of a kind of experiential vividness arising in the here and now, sort of eternal now type of sense. So I think that's actually quite a rich area phenomenologically and perhaps even mechanistically, to the extent to which you want to develop neurocognitive models of this to consider that. But actually also I was interested in this quote of Strawson. I think I wrote it down actually. Bear with me.
This inner experience is occurring, but is it occurring to me?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
No.
So it's that's on there. So now, of course, the point about that is that Strawson says, well, it doesn't actually make sense. Say, I'm having an inner experience, but is it occurring to me? Because it's assumed that to describe an inner experience, it's happening to you. It's part of the sort of presuppositional structure of language and experience from a sort of Wittgensteinian point of view. Except in the case of dissociative identity disorder, or in the case of spirit possession. Because there, actually, what it is, people do have experiences, but then what becomes problematized is the subjective experience. So again, I suppose what I think psychopathology and also sort of culturally normative variation in experience provides us with many analogues variations in experience which sort of tease apart or unsettle certain aspects of our presumed selfhood, are sort of taken for granted selfhood. So I think actually that there probably is a, there is a sort of point that can be made to Strawson. So under certain circumstances, actually, that is a meaningful question.
Well, I very much agree with the point about the analogs in ordinary experience, and that's also, I think, one of at least the attempts of our revised model to emphasize this a bit more than has been done in the past in much of the self-disorder research, where you have this idea that there is a kind of very distinctive gestalt of schizophrenic self-experience, which is completely different from ordinary experience, right? The fact that we emphasize this sort of dynamic changes and alterations already, highlight the fact that these kind of experiences actually evolve and emerge from more dynamic shifts in experience, and that can also, of course, occur in, for example, in psychedelic experience. The parallels are obvious. And for example, in Lewis' original work, it's all about the parallel between certain forms of mad experience or madness and certain forms of modernism, and so that's it's very, very accurate, and there's also something we try to highlight more than has been done in the past. Yeah. Then with regard to Strawson's remark, of course, it's an enduring philosophical issue whether this kind of whether even self-disorders actually cast doubt on Strawson's sense of I-ness, right? Because even patients who report these experiences of so-called self-disorder are not really confused about who is actually experiencing these experiences, right? So you could argue that even in this case, this kind of Strawsonian self would still be present in a way, because that actually allows you to report on these experiences as being experiences that occur to yourself. And that's one of the reasons why we developed this more philosophical paper on the transparency view of consciousness, suggesting that what actually happens is not so much a kind of loss of a kind of sense of self, but actually the kind of loss of a normal transparency of experience, in which you're normally directly immersed in everything in reality and are not constantly reflecting on yourself, and perhaps that is what patients are actually emphasizing, not so much that their immediate sense of self is lost, but that they are constantly reflecting on everything, and there is a kind of loss of immediate spontaneity. That would be able to account also for Strawson's paradox. That would be an alternative account of it.
Thank you for the talks, very interesting. And I would like to hear, know your reflection about something that I think is quite important for the field, which in a way it's a quite niche field of research, and I think there is something that's been a bit lacking, it's been a bit delicate. It is the translation into more mainstream, let's say, clinical practice, how to implement it into research more easily or in clinical practice. And I would like to know your reflections about that, because most of the research is done with the EASE, right? Prior to that, it was done with the Bond scale of basic symptoms, and we had the EASE. But the EASE is quite a daunting, impenetrable tool.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's very hard to implement. You have to go through the training, then you do a research with the EASE, and then you put yourself in the spotlight for Parnas to criticize your research.
Yeah.
So even when you look at the research that is done with the EASE, it's mostly done by Parnas and their team. There are very few research done with the EASE outside of that sort of niche or selected or closed group, and there have been attempts of doing this like self-rating scales and they are always criticized by it.
Yeah, by the same research group.
And
They're criticized by also the same research
yes,
group.
yeah, mainly criticized by partners, which in a way, okay, they say that you cannot really assess all of this through a self-rating scale. You use a lot of, you have to do a phenomenological interview. Okay, it makes sense, right? But at the same time, you see, okay, but how would you, so what I would like to know is how would you bring it down a bit? Because, okay, you can bring it down, you can make it simplified, but you risk losing the richness, and the concepts might get diluted.
Yeah.
So you run that risk. So in a way, partners' concerns are understandable. But you also, on the other side, you run the risk of just remaining as this sort of niche thing for phenomenological research that doesn't really get its like real world, let's say, implementation. So what are your reflections on that? That's something that I'm interested in, because I think it's quite a difficult challenge.
I mean, there is no real solution to that critique in the sense that you cannot like really stick to the phenomenological detail and also do some kind of different type of research. For example, in the kind of research that we're currently conducting on the more longitudinal research, it's just impossible to actually conduct these at numerous time points because it's way too extensive. And so there's no real solution, but I mean, it's just a trade-off, right? There's a trade-off between, on the one hand, trying to preserve some of the phenomenological validity and detail, and on the other hand, just realizing that research is not only about phenomenological description. There are also other aims, other goals, and so you really need to adapt some of your research approaches to the kind of aims that you're heading for, right? But I think that's a very legitimate way of doing phenomenologically informed research, and I actually really don't agree with the kind of very harsh critique of the Copenhagen group that in a way every research that hasn't been conducted through these is meaningless. I mean, that's just a way of really isolating phenomenology even further. And I think there are numerous examples of research approaches that, for example, try to combine more structured measures, self-report measures with qualitative research approaches. So try to like balance these two so in a way both have phenomenological depth, but also in a way just being still amenable to everyday.
There really is a shorter version of the East this year.
There is, there are a number of versions, but I also agree with some of their critiques that, of course, it comes with a certain risk, but it's not a risk that, I mean, should like keep us to doing East research for the rest of our lives, right? We need to try to find alternative solutions, and I guess, for example, the research that we're currently doing, which combines experience sampling research with qualitative longitudinal research, is just one way to counterbalance some of these issues. I'm sure it wouldn't gain the approval of Parnassus group, but still, perhaps we're not aiming for his approval.
Thank you. Any other questions? So I was interested, again, sort of follows on from the previous question. You cited, two things which are interconnected. One is the paper of Nancy Anderson that you referred to, the 2007 paper, which spoke about the sort of death of phenomenology or decline of phenomenology. And then just above that, I think you referenced some of the work of Jim Van Oss, and so that's a sort of view of psychosis, dimensional, very reliant upon the administration of symptom questionnaires in very large populations.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it therefore exposed to the risk that you end up with a very atomised version of psychosis, that you've got lots of discrete particles of experience that can be measured, and then you do test a statistical association between them and sort of view them as distributed in the population and so on. So it seems to me that one of the things that you're potentially doing is identifying essentially a unifying explanation, by virtue of which these discrete atoms of experience are in fact not discrete atoms of experience at all, but they share properties in common. And by virtue of sharing properties in common, they form meaningful, psychologically meaningful clusters or interrelated alterations of experience, which therefore can't be considered as comprising discrete atoms, but actually form meaningful totalities within the formation of experience. So, if that is the case, what is your view of the dimensional, well, do you accept the critique of that kind of questionnaire-based research? And if so, what's your view of dimensional views of psychosis?
Yeah. Well, it's a big question, of course, but in a way, I agree with the dimensional critique that there is no point of trying to look for some sort of distinct aspects of experience that has no analog in ordinary experience. But I am at the same time, I'm also critical about this more research, for example, conducted by Jim Van As on continua, in the sense that, of course, it's one thing to argue for a continuum of experience, but that doesn't really explain or make clear what kind of continuum we're considering. As an example, for example, their work on delusions. There are a lot of arguments that delusions, they're not really so distinct because, all sorts of people believe all sorts of crazy ideas and weird ideas. Whereas I don't think that is the right continuum to draw. I think there can be a continuum if we look at the sort of examples that you just mentioned, like for example in psychedelic experience, these milder forms of derealization that don't really depend on cognitive processes of belief formation. And so you could have like a meaningful continuum from that class of experience to delusions in schizophrenia-spectrum conditions. But that really requires a more in-depth phenomenological argument and research to actually argue for this kind of continuum. So I'll just, in summary, I'm not really against that idea of continua. I'm just a bit in line with the argument that Nancy Andreasen developed, that even when we're considering continua, we need more in-depth phenomenology to really make that case in a convincing and meaningful way.
Do you think in the emergence of psychosis, people reach a point of crystallization where a whole suite of changes occur simultaneously? So the concept of the delusional mood, and then something's going on. I know it's different, and then there's a transition, and a whole set of changes occur simultaneously, where a new form of meaningfully congruent experience of the world sort of emerges, in which a number of seemingly seemingly distinct features of psychological behaviour become thematically reorganised to conform a particular view, confer a particular view of the world.
Well, that's a sort of idea that we develop in the dynamical systems theory, which actually starts from the very same idea that you have, in a way, sort of continuous build-up based on experiences that are very ordinary, and they increase, and at a certain moment there is a sort of qualitative shift from that sort of baseline into a different pattern of experience that may be experienced in a qualitatively different way. So I very much agree with that argument, but it also not really requires rejecting the continuum view.
Well,
correct?
it sort of very, very substantially qualifies the continuum view.
It qualifies it, but it doesn't like make you want to argue for a categorical distinction in the way that, for example, the Copenhagen group has been emphasizing, where there is no real-world analog with, for example, self-disorders in schizophrenia. There you can still have like a certain extent an analog in everyday experience, while recognizing that sort of intensification of these experiences may result in a qualitative shift of experience.
So setting aside the issue of stigma, should the concept of schizophrenia be retained, or should it be retired?
Yeah. Well, that actually exceeds just mere, philosophical and conceptual issues. It's also about the meaning and the impact these diagnoses have in real-world circumstances. And in that respect, I think, well, considering everything, perhaps it should be reconsidered as a diagnosis.
Is there a phenomenological core that motivates the concept?
Well, I think so, yeah. I still think so, that there is some kind of distinct pattern, although it has analogs in everyday experience that sets these type of experiences apart from, for example, the kind of experiences that may occur in bipolar forms of psychosis. So in that sense, I think it might be important to retain the diagnosis, but that's not the only argument you can make for rejection of retainment of that category. So it's a very complex issue. Yeah.
Any questions further? We're approaching the home stretch. We've got a few minutes to go. Please do.
Well, I suppose Quentin's questions just sort of stimulated me in thinking in a similar way, really, that I think as a clinical psychiatrist, if you leave aside the affective disorders and you leave aside all of the disorders that Quentin was alluding to, sort of multiple personality and so on, and just think of non-affective psychosis. So just think of the sort of schizophrenia-spectrum disorders and thinking of everything from very transitory psychotic states right through to a very established chronic schizophrenic state. I think clinically a question you're always asking is, can I stop this person's medication? And will the psychosis re-emerge? And of course the person who also analysed Schreber, I've read Louis' both his books many years ago, like John. But of course, the famous person who analysed Schreber was Freud, and his way of looking at Schreber was that there had been a breach between his subjectivity and the world, and that breach couldn't be rebuilt, but there could be a reconnection, but not a real one, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. So the idea being that schizophrenia, if it's anything at all, is a breach that cannot be healed. And I suppose to some extent, as a psychiatrist, you're trying to work that out, aren't you? You're trying to work out whether, should I, say, remove this person's medication, remove myself perhaps as a psychiatrist. And there's lots of arguments about this in the recovery model, aren't there? The idea that, in South East London, I think there's 20,000 people with non-affective psychosis known to this trust. 15,000 have been discharged without follow-up. And so it's got real practical, real-world things of, is there something called schizophrenia, which is a breach, however we define it, phenomenologically, psychoanalytic, whatever we want to do, that is never healed? Mm-hmm. Or is there something the same, as you say, on a continuum, as you're saying, with all these disorders? Mm-hmm. And I can think of several patients I've got who've had acute and transitory psychotic states who are still taking very tiny doses of medication. Can I safely say, you're fine, the breach is healed, you'll be okay? Mm-hmm. So what are the practical implications?
Yeah, so important questions. And I don't think that these kind of answers can be sufficiently answered on a phenomenological level. The only thing that we can do is describe certain patterns of experience, but that doesn't tell you anything about how permanent or irreparable or enduring these patterns are. And I think we should also, refrain from doing so as phenomenologists. And I think that would be better, just because sometimes certain positions are taken that actually exceeds the frontiers or the borders of what is meaningful to say on a phenomenological level. So I would answer your very meaningful clinical question in the same way. I don't think there are any hard arguments to make on a phenomenological level to answer these kind of concerns. And we need, different types of research methods, follow-up research, perhaps, hopefully informed by phenomenological research, looking at, the transient or enduring character of these experiences. And we would need different forms of phenomenological research that actually allows one to actually do this more follow-up research beyond these very extensive clinical interviews. So I don't have a real answer, just share the concern and.
Actually, just thinking about that. I do think phenomenology could be useful for the situation you described, because one of let's go back to your notion of some kind of fundamental breach in a person's relationship with the felt experience of the world. That's actually quite difficult to capture in a questionnaire, at least standard available questionnaires, but it's the sort of thing that phenomenologists might be interested in. And so you might have somebody who takes antipsychotic medication whose symptoms, to the extent that they can be measured in symptom scales, remit. But there might nevertheless be important predictors as to whether or not that person has recovered, or actually still has a fundamentally unsettled reality orientation, whereby if you, and the fact that this unsettled reality orientation, how we characterise that, if you withdraw medication, the people with that may be more likely to relapse. So it's a question for phenomenologically informed longitudinal research embedded in clinical designs.
Sure. Well, the point still stands that you need an accurate phenomenological description of the kind of breach that people are experiencing, but that doesn't tell you anything about how enduring or permanent such a breach might be. And for that you need different other methods, phenomenologically informed, but beyond the typical extensive clinical interview, of course.
The other point, Robbie, is actually what is it that alarms you when you see somebody in clinic and they haven't relapsed? You think, hold on, something's going on here. And that's what is it that's motivating that sense that there's trouble brewing?
And it's very hard, coming back to your point, to sometimes distinguish the kind of obsessionality, hyper-reflexivity of,
Absolutely.
I had a breach once, but now it's cured, but I'm keeping an eye on it, from there's still a breach.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
It's very difficult to unpick.
Well, I think if there's perhaps room for one final question, or we could conclude with a vote of thanks. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation and discussion.